Today we'll see something different from what I usually show on the channel. These are the strangest planes I know of. From extravagant designs to experimental technology, these planes really stand out for how they look or how they operate. I managed to make a very long list with some of the strangest aircraft I know, but here I bring you only 30 to continue surprising us with the fascinating world of aviation. And let's start the list with a really weird one. The Proteus really breaks away from conventional aircraft design. It's a high-altitude, long-endurance plane with tandem wings designed by the famous designer Burt Rutan to investigate the use of high-altitude telecommunications aircraft. It has an extremely efficient design and was able to orbit a point at over 19,800 meters. For more than 18 hours. It first flew in 1998 and currently the only plane built is owned by Northrop Grumman. The Germans of World War II have really amazing designs like the Lippisch P-13, an interceptor project with Allen Delta and powered by a ramjet designed by aeronautical engineer Alexander Lippisch for the German Luftwaffe at the end of 1944 during the end of World War II. It was part of the set of revolutionary weapons announced as Miraculous or the Wunderwaffe with the aim of changing the course and ending the war. But the war ended before it could even fly, although engineer Lippisch continued working with American aircraft manufacturer Convair, where he developed and tested the Convair XF-92, which did fly in 1948 and was also originally conceived as an interceptor, although it was ultimately used as a test bed for the Delta Wing concept. This prototype helped Convair to use the Delta Wing design in several later models such as the F-102 Delta Dagger, the F-106 Delta Dart or the B-58 Hustler. And of all these planes we already have a video in the Aeropedia section. The Stratolaunch is a plane built to carry air-launched rockets to orbit. It first flew on April 13, 2019, shortly after the death of founder Paul Allen. The plane featured a dual fuselage design and the longest wingspan in aviation history. It is designed to carry a payload of 250 tons. As of April 2023, the Stratolaunch has only flown 10 times, including 3 with a hypersonic test plane. The XF-Pogo conveyor was an experimental vertical takeoff and landing or vertical takeoff and landing aircraft developed during the early years of the Cold War. It was intended to be a high-performance fighter aircraft capable of operating from small warships. It had a unique design of delta wings and 3-blade counter-rotating propellers powered by a turboprop engine. Test flights began in 1954, and it was observed that landing was extremely difficult, where the pilot had to look over his shoulder while carefully operating the throttle to maneuver. The entire project ended in 1955 for being impractical. A very rare project was the Abrocar, a Canadian balanced takeoff and landing aircraft developed by Abro Canada during the Cold War. It intended to take advantage of the Coanda effect to provide lift and thrust from a single turborotor, expelling exhaust gases through the edge of the disc-shaped aircraft. In flight tests, the Abrocar proved to have not solved the thrust and stability problems that limited it to a degraded, low-performance flight envelope. Subsequently, the project was cancelled in September of 1961 after only 2 prototypes were manufactured. Created by the Italian Gianni Caprioni, it was a prototype for 100 passengers powered by 8 engines and had a total of 9 wings. There was only one model that flew for the first time in 1921. 2 days later, on March 4th, the plane hit the surface of the water. The CA-60 suffered severe structural damage but received even more when it was towed to shore. They wanted to rebuild it, but the cost was too high and it never flew again. Another seaplane design, but completely different, was the CID-AR, an American combat aircraft which used hydroskis during takeoff and a landing on water. It is the only seaplane that has exceeded the speed of sound. 5 prototypes were built, but it never went into mass production. It was created in the 50s to overcome the problems that supersonic planes had taking off and landing on aircraft carriers. I'd like to create a video on this aircraft for the Aeropedia. If you find other machines you'd like in the Aeropedia, leave them in the comments. An extravagant design that was developed shortly before World War II was the Blunt & Boss 141 seaplanes, introduced the 141 project, whose design was a priority. Blunt & Boss, more famous for their seaplanes, introduced the 141 project, whose design was clearly very strange due to its asymmetry. Despite the design, this plane proved to have very good flight characteristics, and after refinements, the Luftwaffe ordered 500 units. However, World War II forced a change of course. With only 28 units built, the project was cancelled in favour of the twin-engine Focke-Wulf FW-189. And all these 28 aircraft were destroyed during the conflict. The boundary layer control, 73, originates from the theory of engineer Charles Zimmermann in the 40s, that aircraft with circular wings could fly at very low speeds. The project caught the attention of the United States Navy, which was looking for aircraft that could take off and land in the short space of aircraft carriers. We already have a video of this aircraft on the channel, I'll leave it in the cards. The lessons learned with the 173 led to the XF-5U much more powerful and refined. Even so, the two planes did not leave the prototype phase. In the late 30s and early 40s, the Soviet aviation industry had also developed and tested a variety of aircraft design concepts, and some quite peculiar ones. Viktor Belyaev, a Russian engineer, was an advocate for tailless aircraft designs, but he also tested the so-called bat wings, which he claimed offered better performance due to their lower resistance and greater stability. From there came designs like the DP-2, a glider that evolved into the DBLK, of which only one prototype was built that flew in 1940. And as the Germans never stopped creating extravagant designs testing concepts in the Second World War, another example of this was the Natter, a German point defense interceptor powered by rockets. The main function of the pilot was to aim the plane at a target bomber and fire its rocket weaponry. The pilot and the fuselage containing the rocket engine would land using a separate parachute, while the nose section was disposable. The first and only manned vertical takeoff flight was on March 1, 1945 and ended in tragedy, and the 36 units built were not used afterwards. This strange aircraft was designed for a National Aeronautics and Space Administration test program conducted between 79 and 82 at the Dryden Flight Research Center to successfully demonstrate that an airplane wing could rotate obliquely from 0 to 60 degrees during flight and be effective. The airplane flew 79 times during the research program, which evaluated the basic concept of a pivoting wing and collected information on handling qualities and aerodynamics at various speeds and degrees of pivot. The French design of the Colopter was a vertical takeoff and landing balanced takeoff and landing design, from the French company Snegma and manufactured by Nord Aviation. It was a single-seat aircraft with an unusual annular wing and first flew in 1959. The only prototype was destroyed on its 9th flight, and they were never able to secure funding to build a second prototype. The Stipa Caprioni was an experimental Italian design from 1932 created by aeronautical engineer Luigi Stipa and built by the Caprioni company. The annular type fuselage, inside which the engine is located where the flow of the propeller penetrated. This meant that it would perform better than conventional airplanes, but it did not, and the project was cancelled. All the pilots who tested it agreed in indicating that the plane was extremely stable in flight, to the point that it was difficult to make it change course. The Dynover was a tilt-wing monoplane, also for vertical takeoff and landing, designed and manufactured by Canadair between 64 and 72. Only 4 of these experimental planes were built, and 3 went into flight. Despite conducting tests, no potential customers placed orders. The McDonnell XF-85 Goblin is a prototype of American fighter aircraft conceived during the Second World War by McDonnell Aircraft, but only flew in 1948. It was intended to be deployed from the bomb bay of a bomber with B-36 as a parasite fighter to defend the bombers from hostile interceptor aircraft. Only 2 prototypes were built before the Air Force or the United States Air Force ended the program. When the United States Navy tried to combine the Mach 2 speed and the armament of an F-4 Phantom and vertical takeoff, they came up with the Rockwell XFV-12. Unfortunately, it could never demonstrate a vertical takeoff and its inability to meet performance requirements ended the program in 1981. The Germans didn't lose their creativity for odd planes, and we see it in the Dornier Do 31 from West Germany's Dornier, which flew for the first time in vertical takeoff and landing designed and produced by the West German aircraft manufacturer Dornier, which flew for the first time in 1967. A total of 3 planes were built and used for testing, 2 with flight capabilities and 1 for static tests. When they realized the high cost and the technical and logistical difficulties of operating such an aircraft, the German Air Force chose to suspend tests with vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. The Bartini-Beriev 14 was a strange hybrid of airplane and ecranoplan, designed to take advantage of the ground effect like an ecranoplan and fly a few meters above the ground, or rather the sea, but at the same time it was equipped with 30-meter wingspan wings that would have allowed it to reach an altitude of 33,000 feet. Only 2 prototypes were created that first flew in 1972. The conveyor NB26H doesn't look very strange. It's built with nuclear propulsion. But this is the only prototype that flew in 1955. It carried a nuclear propulsion. But this is the only prototype that flew in 1955. It carried a nuclear reactor to test its radiation protection for the crew, but in this case it was not used to propel the plane. It was just to demonstrate the viability of a future nuclear propulsion bomber. The Griffin was a fighter designed and built in the mid-50s by the French manufacturer Aviation. It was part of a series of programs seeking the development of a very fast fighter for the French Air Force. It featured a large tubular fuselage that supported the delta wings, the tail with the rudder, and the forward fuselage that extended forward over an air intake of a ramjet. In attempts to create the world's smallest airplane, I'm going to highlight 2 designs. The Skybaby, designed by Ray Titz and built by Robert Stark in 1952, and the Bumblebee 2, another experimental aircraft from the same builder but even smaller, which flew in 1988. This configuration is called a sesquiplane and had jet propulsion. The Polish aeronautical company Państwowe Zakłady Lotnicze Mielec designed and manufactured it for agricultural aviation. It was called Belfegor, which was a noisy demon. The inaugural flight took place on May 20th, 1973. It could accommodate 3 crew members. Part of the lower wings and the chemical tanks were made of materials to prevent corrosion. The upper and lower wings were coned by 2 columns that housed the chemical tanks. It has been described as the heaviest biplane ever produced. Its production ended in 1981, being a very expensive aircraft with poor operation. Taught by Northrop, the XP-56 was almost a flying wing, with a short fuselage that housed a radial engine and the cockpit. The first prototype took off for the first time in 1943. During evaluations, the aircraft presented serious instability problems, especially in yaw movement, and less than a month later, the first XP-56 ended up distributed in a takeoff accident. After the construction of a second prototype, the United States Air Force then cancelled the project as it had poor performance and the era of jet planes was arriving. This was another French plane from the early 30s, shown at the Paris Aeronautics Salon of 1930. It had capacity for 12 passengers in twin fuselages. Separated between them, these capsules shared a tailplane and a high wing. The central section of the wing joined the pods of the and it also carried a gondola that contained an engine at each end and the crew compartment in the middle. In 31, it flew with very poor aeronautical characteristics. Attempts were made to improve it until 33, but it did not achieve certification and the only prototype was discarded the following year. The Optica was a light British aircraft designed for low-speed observation work, manufactured by the British company Adelaide with a fully glazed front cabin that provided a great view for the pilot and 2 passengers. It features a Lycoming engine located behind the cabin that drives a fan with fixed ducts. Its first flight took place on December 14th of 79, and there are a total of 22 units built. Rare to see is this parasol circular wing configuration of the Nemeth parasol. It's designed by Stephen Nemeth from Dayton, Ohio, and made its first flight in 34. The goal was to have a plane that could be stored in a large garage instead of a hangar, and that was easy to fly. Only one prototype ended up being built. The Westland P-12 Wandover was a prototype plane developed by the British during World War II. The plane was a development of the Westland Lysander, a workhorse used by the Royal Air Force Aerolento, and was easy to detect by enemy fighters. The loss rate of these planes was very high. In just 2 months, 118 of the 175 deployed were lost. That's why they tried to improve with the Wendover, with the rear greatly modified to defend against enemy fighters. The Ascender, an American prototype fighter plane from the 40s, built by Curtiss Wright with an unusual design, had a canard configuration, an engine mounted in the rear, swept wings, and 2 vertical tails. It was also the first Curtiss combat aircraft to use tricycle landing gear. 3 prototypes were made, but the program was cancelled as conventional aircraft performed its function better. Ending this long video, I would like you to tell me which aircraft we saw you would like to see in the Aeropedia section so that we can delve into it, because there are many very rare aircraft that you know and were left off the list, that there are surely many more. A new installment of Aviation World.